This Saturday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we have a Big Ten football matchup between the 13th ranked, undefeated 8-0, 5-0 in Big Ten play Indiana Hoosiers, who are traveling to East Lansing to Spartan Stadium to face off against the Michigan State Spartans, who are 4-4, 2-3 in Big Ten play. And the Hoosiers opened up as a 7-point favorite. The line has crawled up to Indiana minus 7.5, so the Hoosiers are laying 7.5 on the road. Michigan State is barely over a touchdown underdog in terms of spread, and the Hoosiers are given an 83.4% chance to win this game per ESPN's FPI. There is some uncertainty with quarterback Curtis Rourke and whether he will play in this game. Curt Cignetti says he thinks that he's on track to be healthy soon and that he's optimistic about his injury, and they're working him in terms of starting reps and letting him throw after his thumb surgery. This game is going to be streamed exclusively on Peacock, which I personally think is, of course, with hyperbole here, I personally think is a war crime, but I'm not going to talk about that a whole lot. It's just with one question: what are you doing, college football? Why do you have to do this to the fans? I personally have a Peacock subscription, but it's annoying because you have to go into a whole different app when it's not on YouTube TV. It's not on a major network. Like, it's its own separate thing. Why make it more complicated? It just does not help with a fan experience that I feel like is already trending down, to put it kindly. But I want to talk about the football here. Michigan State beat Indiana 24-21 in 2023. Indiana and Michigan State are protected rivals under the new Big Ten scheduling format. It's a battle for the old brass spittoon, a historic Big Ten matchup, rivalry. And I'm excited to talk about this game because for Indiana, they can earn their 9th win, their 6th win in conference, and then they play Michigan the following week after this week. And then they have a bye. Then they play Ohio State, and then they play Purdue. There's a path to 12-0. There's a path easily to 11-1. 10-2 almost looks like a guarantee, but nothing is guaranteed. And they have to get through a Michigan State team who was able to bully Iowa in Spartan Stadium. It is a Michigan State team that has one of the better coaching staffs in the country. They're very creative. Michigan State, I don't know what their psyche is like after that loss to Michigan, which was a gut punch, I would say. But they return home. Indiana has some questions at quarterback. Indiana, I think, is one of the better teams in the country, could be the best team in the country, but this is yet again one of their tougher games in a schedule that just has not been that hard. So let's dive in and talk about this matchup. But before we do, I want you, if you can, to help out the channel. And you can do that by subscribing to the channel, by liking the video. Please hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new college football content here on this YouTube channel. Share this video around so that other college football fans can discover us and join this awesome community. And comment your preview for this game, any points of analysis that you have, and also your score prediction and who you think is going to win. And last but not least, join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment, where we have conversational threads for all Big Ten teams. 5, 10, 15, 18. All 18 Big Ten teams we have a conversational thread for. And we have conversational threads for the Group of 5, for the ACC, SEC, Big 12. You want to talk college football? If you even want to talk FCS college football, no matter what, there is a space to do that on the College Football with Sam Discord server. And the link to join that, which is totally free, is in the description and also down below in the pinned comment. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, support us on Patreon by signing up as a paid member or purchase merchandise from our merchandise store, and the links to those are in the description and also down below in the pinned comment at the top of the comment section. But liking, sharing, subscribing, hitting the bell, commenting, watching the video all the way through, and joining the Discord server, those are all free things. They benefit you out by giving you awesome analysis now and in the future, and they also help out this channel because we reinvest everything that we can into this channel because we want to grow it, and we believe that it can become the best college football channel on YouTube. It's already the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube. We just crossed 20,000 subscribers, and at the end of the regular season, we will be doing a giveaway. But that's the last I'll mention about that because this is a big game. This is a game that I'm excited for. This is one of those games where, as I said earlier, placing it on Peacock is a crime, especially for this game, because it is a big-time matchup for both programs. It's a big game. It's important for Curt Cignetti. It's important for Jonathan Smith. It's important for these players. And consequently, it is a game where I am thankful that I can comfortably afford a Peacock subscription. I'm very thankful for that and blessed for that, because I can watch this game in full. Indiana is viewed as a better team than Michigan State. But the Spartans, remember, they're at home, and I don't think the stadium is going to be very empty. I could be wrong on that, but it's a new year, it's a new era, and Jonathan Smith and his staff are only in year one. And while they did lose to Michigan this past weekend in painful fashion, just 2 weeks ago, they kind of dominated Iowa on their own home field. And it's not a noon game, so I expect engagement. I expect a challenging road environment. This is going to be the toughest road environment, by the way, that Indiana has played in all season long. It is. This is Indiana's toughest game of the year in terms of the adversity that the home team will provide for the Spartans. There's a weird way of phrasing it, but basically, Indiana is playing in a stadium, Spartan Stadium, that when it's full and when the fans are engaged is loud, it's intimidating. Wouldn't shock me if there was maybe a false start or Indiana looked a little jittered, a little shook in the first drive, but Indiana is the better team. They're viewed as 17.2 points better than the average college football team per FPI, 18.3 points better than the average college football team per Bill Connolly's S&P+. In FPI, Michigan State is viewed as 1.4 points better than the average college football team and 1 point worse than the average college football team per S&P+. You factor in home field advantage, I'd say Spartan Stadium can provide anywhere from 3 to 5 points in home field advantage, maybe 6 if it's really engaged in a night game, but this isn't a night game, and I think it'll be full, but Spartan games in the past have also been fairly empty, especially when things don't go so well. I don't know exactly what the gauge is with Michigan State, both their roster, their coaching staff, and their fan base. I know what Indiana's is, and that's what makes this game really intriguing, because remember, the spread's only Indiana minus 7.5, and yet FPI and S&P Plus are telling you that even factoring in home field advantage, that 3 to 5 points for Michigan State, they're telling you that Indiana should win this game by anywhere from 14 to 16 points for S&P Plus, and for FPI, they're telling you that, well, Michigan or Indiana should win this game by anywhere from 13 to 11. I mean, Indiana, by both S&P Plus, by FPI, and this is after you've factored in home field advantage. If Michigan State and their fan base is not as engaged as I think they are, you may take that home field advantage away and kind of treat it like a neutral site. Indiana is projected to win this game by anywhere from 2 to 3 scores, and yet the line is only 7.5. So either Vegas knows that people will be betting on Michigan State, which may make sense because Indiana is a team that keeps overperforming the spread and is a team that does not have a lot of blue chip talent. Consequently, many would say that means they don't have a lot of depth, although I disagree with that. But there is some validity to that theory. And it's their toughest road environment they've played in all season long. And Michigan State does have some wrinkles. They have some aces up their sleeve. And I think that they have one of the better coaching staffs in all of college football. So this matchup to me is one that I'm going to be paying attention to, one that I'm going to be glued to. I know that Oregon-Michigan is in the 3:30 window, same time as this game. Penn State-Ohio State's obviously the game of the week that I'm going to be paying the most attention to, but I may be paying more attention to this game than Michigan-Oregon, unless Michigan-Oregon's a dogfight and it's competitive for more than a quarter, because Michigan, at this point, you're looking to rebuild and bounce back for next year. Oregon looks like the best team in the country. I've already predicted Oregon to beat Michigan pretty handily. This game was a little bit tougher to decide. I had to think more about it, if I'm being honest. And again, that's despite the fact Indiana's the way better team. They've played an easier schedule, yes, and in a few seconds we'll talk about that. But their points per play margin is 0.37. That means for every one of Indiana's plays to every one of their average opponent's plays, they're scoring 0.37 more points. On an average basis, Indiana is blowing out their opponents, and they have never been in a one-score game with any opponent they've played all season long. I think their closest margin of victory, in fact, was last weekend against Washington at home. And Indiana had a backup quarterback. I think the playbook was obviously dumbed down. And Washington had a bye. And they have a good coaching staff. So they probably played one of their better games of the season. I think on defense they certainly did. And Indiana still beat them by 14 points. And it was a 17-point game for a part of the fourth quarter as well. This is a really good team. And their expected points added margin is 0.247. So in a variety of statistics, a variety of power ratings, Indiana they're a top 15 at the very worst, and I'd say top 10 or top 5 at the very best caliber team. Michigan State has a negative 0.094 points per play margin and an expected points added margin of 0.026. So on an average basis, Michigan State loses a football game that they play in, and this is especially the case when perteamrankings.com, where I got my points per play margin stat, they factor out the FCS games. That 40-0 win over Prairie View A&M, who was by far the weakest opponent State played all year, well, that's not counted all that much. And I kind of agree with that in like most of the time. There are some times where maybe if you play in North Dakota State or a higher level FCS school, it's like playing a group of 5 school or maybe a inferior power 4 opponent. So, okay, count it. But Prairie View A&M is not a good football team at all. And it's obvious that Michigan State, well, that they played a much better game against Prairie View A&M because they were vastly superior compared to every other team on the schedule, where they did not have that same level of dominance. It looked like a weaker, honestly, Michigan State playing Prairie View A&M looked like a weaker SEC team just puffing up their resume against an FCS opponent in November. That's what that game looked like. That's what that game reminded me of. They're still, in my opinion, a team that can play at a high level, depending on the Saturday that they're playing on. But they're not consistent. And you see that in game control, where Michigan State's 48th. They've played a top 10 schedule. Indiana has not even played a top 100 schedule yet. They're 106th in strength of schedule. But Indiana is third in game control. So even factoring in their strength of schedule, which game control does, according to ESPN's computers, only 2 teams. Those are Ohio State and Ole Miss. I think Indiana's much better than Ole Miss, by the way. Per ESPN's computers, only those 2 teams would perform at a higher level with Indiana's schedule. Only 2. For Michigan State, 47 teams would perform at a higher level against Indiana's schedule, or against Michigan State's schedule. My apologies. And their strength of schedule is 10th. So Michigan State is certainly more battle-tested, but that doesn't matter all that much if you haven't done anything with it. Indiana is not as battle-tested, but at every turn, at every corner, even in moments where people have doubted them, many picked Nebraska to beat them. I imagine some thought that Washington would upset them. Didn't happen. And Indiana won, and they controlled their way to victory. The critical matchup in this game, I think, is Indiana's defense against Michigan State's rushing offense. What Michigan State has done in back-to-back games against Iowa and Michigan, they went 1-1 in those games, but when you look at rushing yards, when you look at time of possession, when you look at total yards, and honestly, when you look at scoring opportunities, Michigan State won both of those games. The difference is against Michigan State made some mistakes. Against Iowa made more mistakes than the Spartans did, and that's really why they beat Iowa, and that's why they lost to Michigan. But their game plans have been similar. You run the football a lot, and you do it just well enough to where you keep the opposing defense very honest. And then you situationally pass. That's been the basic strategy for Michigan State football over the past 2 games, and I think it's smart. You limit the time that your opponents have to score. You limit their possessions. You try to boa constrictor them. You try and game control them. And it worked against Iowa. Didn't exactly work against Michigan, but on another day it probably does, because that game was pretty close. And in the first quarter, it certainly looked like Michigan State was going to come away with that game in a dominant win. Indiana's defense, though, is quietly performing as one of the better defenses in the country. Again, they faced a very weak strength of schedule, but in watching their defense, it feels like it's getting better week over week over week. They are elite in the fundamentals, at tackling, at sticking to their assignments, and at not breaking down. They're well conditioned. They're strong. They don't have a plethora of NFL players in terms of first rounders like what Michigan or Penn State do on defense, or what many projected Ohio State to have on defense in the preseason, or even what Iowa has. But that may change at the end of this season. And right now they certainly have players that could be NFL free agents, that could be third rounders, second rounders, later round picks. And maybe by the end of the year, who knows, maybe they'll have a lot of guys that the NFL's interested in on that defense. I really like Indiana's defense, and I think the numbers back that up. Indiana dominates Michigan State in offense, but let's look at Indiana's defense before getting to Michigan State's offense. These defenses, I think, are both well coached. Again, the difference is Michigan State has played far better offenses. Michigan State, in terms of scoring defense, allows 24.3 points per game, which is 55th. Indiana allows 15.7, which is 8th. Indiana forces their opponents to gain 18.5 yards to score a single point. That's 11th. That's opponent yards per point. Michigan State is 75th in yards per point. Their opponents gain 14 yards to score a single point. The Spartans, their opponents average 0.378 points per play. That's 66th. Indiana's opponents only average 0.246 points per play on Indiana's defense. That's 9th. You look at red zone scoring attempts and red zone scores per game. Indiana's top 15 in both of those categories. Michigan State is outside the top 45. Moving on to total defense. Indiana is 10th in opponent yards per game, only allowing 290.7. Michigan State's 40th, allowing 341.1. In opponent yards per play, Indiana, they only allow 4.6 yards per play. Michigan State's defense allows 5.3. And these numbers factor out their games against FCS opponents, where Indiana beat theirs, 77-3. Michigan State beat theirs 40-0. So there's that. Take a look at the rushing defense, which is where I'm really focusing on in regards to Indiana's defense in what I think is the biggest matchup of the game. Indiana only allows opponents to rush for 96.7 yards per game. That's 9th. Opponents only average 6 rushing first downs per game in Indiana's defense, which is 15th. And opponents only average 3.4 yards per carry in Indiana, which is 18th. Michigan State's outside of the top 30 in all of those statistics that I named. In passing defense, the Hoosiers are 3rd in opponent yards per completion. Opponents only average 9.4 yards per completion against Indiana. You know why that is? They never miss tackles. Trust me, watch the film. Indiana rarely, and I mean rarely, misses a tackle. It's like it's an anomaly. Believe me, it's an exception to the rule. And opponents only average 6 yards per pass attempt against Indiana, which is 15th. The Hoosiers' sack percentage is 7.32%, which is 33rd. That means on 7.32% of opponent dropbacks, Indiana gets a sack. Michigan State's is only 5.88%, and they only have one sack in 5 Big Ten games. So the pass rush looked strong. It looked hot earlier in the year, but against Big Ten opponents, it has not shown up a whole lot. So they have some issues on defense, the Spartans do, especially in terms of personnel. But we're focusing on Indiana's defense mainly here. And the fact is, Indiana's defense is one of the better defenses, I think, in the Big Ten and in the country. But is it top 10? I don't know that yet. I have nowhere close to the information I need to say that is a certainty. And Michigan State, I believe, is the best rushing offense, at least currently, that Indiana has played all season long. Because, well, maybe at the end of the year, if Nebraska blocks like how they did against Ohio State, and Ohio State's defensive front is legit and one of the better ones in the country, well, maybe in hindsight, Indiana just had a really good game against a Nebraska rushing offense that finished well on the season. And Washington is Jonah Coleman. And Michigan State doesn't have a running back who I think is as good as Jonah Coleman. I think Nate Carter's close, but not quite there. And Washington has a respectable offensive line. Michigan State has had some injuries there. But the Spartans, they ran successfully against Michigan. They had a great time running the football against Iowa. At times against Ohio State, they were able to run the ball. And you look at these two rushing offenses on the season, Indiana is only averaging 4.7 yards per carry. Their strength is in the passing offense. They're 45th in rushing yards per attempt. They're 38th in rushing yards per game. They average 183.1 yards per game. Michigan State's only averaging 3.9 yards per carry, 85th, and 131.3 rushing yards per game. That's 89th. However, circle back to their top 10 schedule. The fact that Oregon, I think, is one of the best defensive lines in the country, especially when healthy. And really, they have one of the best interior defensive lines, which is more important when it comes to run defense and also just defensive line play in general in the Big Ten. Ohio State has really impressive defensive tackles. Michigan, I think, still is the best defensive tackle duo in all of college football. Iowa has a respected defensive line. Boston College has some nice defensive linemen. So Michigan State hasn't just played a top 10 strength of schedule. You can zoom in on a position that would affect a game in a certain way. And if you zoom in on opposing defensive lines that Michigan State has played a plethora of near elite to elite defensive lines. So I think that rushing offense is better than the statistics would bear out. As for Indiana, that may be the same thing here too. Not in the exact same way, but in the sense that Indiana has been able to be very effective in closing out their games using the power run. And they do a very good job of breaking down their opponents and of moving high-caliber defensive lines around with what is, I think, a great offensive line. It's what they did against Nebraska's defensive line. They were pushing around Nebraska's defense all game long. So this is the critical matchup. Michigan State's Nate Carter, K'Ron Lynch-Adams, Michigan State's offensive line, Stanton Ramil, Luke Newman, Tanner Miller, Brandon Baldwin, and Ashton Lepo, up against Indiana's defense, specifically the front. Mikael Kamara, James Carpenter, Marcus Burris Jr., Linnell Carr Jr., Jalen Walker, Eden Fisher, Mari Farrell, and then, of course, DBs have been making plays and have been pretty good at tackling all season long for Indiana. So cornerback D'Angelo Pons, safeties Josh Sanguinetti and Sean Asbury II, and cornerback Jameer Johnson. That's the matchup to be paying attention to here. Now let's move on to the offenses. I would take Indiana at every position. A tight end, I think, is a push. Velling, I think, has been a little bit disappointing coming to Michigan State from Oregon State, but he's still been a very good tight end. But Indiana is just, they're better, and they outclass the Spartans at every position. Even if, and part of the reason I'm taking Indiana at quarterback is because I'm factoring in that Curtis Rourke may play. And even if it's off thumb surgery, I don't think that Cignetti will put him in unless that he is playing better than Taven Jackson, unless he is. And even if Taven Jackson does start, he looked good against Nebraska. He played really an average game against Washington. I think that he could step up in a big way in this game if he had to start for his second game in a row this season. And Aiden Childs has been, well, turnover happy. He made, even in some of his better games all season, he turned it over against Iowa. And he turned it over against Michigan too. Like, it is a guarantee that you are going to get one Aiden Childs turnover every game. And that, my friends, is the antithesis of a non-negotiable. That you yourself have a player who does not function as a non-negotiable for the opposing team. He functions as a non-negotiable to you. I'm not saying that because I think Aiden Childs is a bad quarterback, because his upside can also serve as a non-negotiable for opposing defenses. His range of outcomes is just very, very wide, and I would prefer definitely Curtis Rourke, and to a certain degree a Taven Jackson over what I have seen from Aiden Childs over this season. Indiana right now, Curtis Rourke leads them in passing. He has 1,941 passing yards, 15 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, averaging 10.7 yards per attempt, completing 74.6% of his throws, a 188.7 passer rating, and in QBR, Curtis Rourke leads the nation with a 91.6 quarterback efficiency rating. Taven Jackson has 349 passing yards, averages 9.4 yards per attempt, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception, a 171.7 passer rating, he averages 9.4 yards per attempt, completes 62.2% of his throws, and on the season he has a 60.6 quarterback efficiency rating. Running backs Justice Ellison, Tyson Lawton, Kalen Black, and Elijah Green each have over 100 rushing yards, and they're averaging 4.9 yards per carry at the worst to 8 yards per carry at the best. They each have at least 2 rushing touchdowns or more. Green has 5, Black has 2, Lawton has 8, and Justice Ellison has 9. Indiana on the season has rushed for 1,605 yards, averages 5 yards per carry. This is factoring in that FCS game. And they've ran for 30 touchdowns. They are very effective at getting those short gains. It's because of their running backs and also because of their offensive line. They are not going to break those huge runs all the time, like Ohio State did earlier in the year, or like Michigan consistently did in 2022. Same thing with Penn State that year. That's not what's going to happen with Indiana. But what they are very good at doing, for context, their longest rush of the season is 51, and that was from Elijah Green, who was 4th with running backs in carries. So they don't often get those big explosive runs, but what they're very good at doing is being consistent in the short to intermediate ground game. And that's how they keep opposing defenses honest. That's how they control the clock. That's how they frustrate defenses and shorten the game and impose their will and dominance, is through their rushing offense. It's why they have 30 rushing touchdowns. They're led in receiving yards by Elijah Surratt with 590 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns. Omar Cooper Jr. has 4 receiving touchdowns, where he's tied for first in receiving touchdowns on the team, 453 receiving yards, and he's averaging 22.6 yards per reception. Miles Price, Miles Cross, Keyshawn Williams, Zach Horton, the tight end, they all at least have 100 receiving yards or more, and all of those players all those players have a receiving touchdown, at least 1. Horton has 2, Williams has 4, Cross has 3, and Price has 1. You look at Michigan State here, and the Spartans, I think they have elements of a good offense. Specifically, I think that Nick Marsh and their wide receiver room and their quarterback, Aiden Childs, when he's functioning at a high level, are cause for concern. Childs has 1,657 passing yards in the year, 7 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, though. He averages 8.1 yards per pass attempt, which is pretty good, but he's also only completing 61% of his throws. He has a 131.4 passer rating, and in QBR on the season, he has a 63.6 quarterback efficiency rating. Kayron Lynch-Adams and Nate Carter both have over 400 rushing yards. They are averaging around 5 yards per carry, and each at least have 2 receiving touchdowns. Adams has 2, Carter has 3. Michigan State only has 9 rushing touchdowns on the season, 7 passing touchdowns. This is a team that struggles mightily in scoring offensive touchdowns. They actually do a pretty good job, I think, of getting to the red zone, of driving down the field in between the 20s. But when you get inside the 20, man, this offense is very painful. And I mean that when I say that, painful to watch. Nick Marsh leads the team, the freshman, in receiving yards with 475, averaging 17 yards per reception with 2 receiving touchdowns. Monterey Foster Jr. is 418 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, averaging 13.5 yards per reception. Jack Velling has 296 receiving yards, no receiving touchdowns, though. And Isaiah Johnson and Jaron Glover also have at least 1 receiving touchdown and over 100 receiving yards. Childs has taken 18 sacks on the season. Curtis Rourke's taken 6. Jackson has taken 1. I do think that at every position, except for tight end, which I think is more contested, Indiana is superior to the Spartans. We already went over rushing offense, but look at the numbers here. Indiana's scoring 42.1 points per game. That's 3rd. Michigan State's only scoring 18.3. That's 117th. Indiana's offense only needs to gain 10.8 yards to score a single point. That's 4th. Michigan State needs nearly double the amount of yards to score the same points as Indiana does, 19.3, which is 127th. Michigan State's offense is averaging 0.283 points per play gained, which is 115th. Indiana's gaining more than double of that per play, 0.161 points per play, to be specific. Offensive touchdowns per game, Michigan State only scores an average of 1.7, 118th. Indiana scores 5.6. That's 2nd. And when you look at red zone scoring attempts per game, Michigan State has 3, which is 92nd. But when you look at red zone scores per game, that goes down to 108th with 2.1. Indiana has a 97.44% red zone scoring percentage, only behind Ohio State in the Big Ten. Michigan State has a 71.43 red zone scoring percentage, which is 124th. So, yeah, Indiana has the much better offense. And you see that also in that Indiana's second in punts per play and punts per offensive score, while MSU's outside the top 50 in those. And in passing offense, Michigan State has had somewhat of an explosive passing attack, but Indiana leads the Spartans by 25 or more places in yards per pass attempt and also yards per completion. Defensively, we already discussed this a lot in our critical matchup breakdown, as I think the two defenses here are really going to decide this game, along with the rushing offenses. I would take Indiana at every position here, if I'm being honest. It's not that there's a big distance in terms of individual talent on these defenses. I like Michigan State's linebacker room. I also like Indiana's. I think Michigan State has talent along the defensive line. The secondary is really where Indiana is clearly miles ahead of the Spartans. And this also comes true in terms of pass rush, especially when you look at how these teams have performed against Big Ten offensive lines. Again, you have to factor in schedule there, but the numbers just scream Indiana, even when you factor in strength of schedule, like we talked about. The Hoosiers are third in game control. That factors in strength of schedule. Michigan State's outside the top 25 in game control despite having a top 10 schedule. Scheduling matters a lot. It does, but scheduling often sorts itself out, especially when two teams play in the same conference. It will all sort itself out. Just ask yourselves, when watching these teams, who is more impressive? If you're a Michigan State fan and an Indiana fan, heck, if you're a Big Ten football fan or a college football fan, what team would you want your team to emulate, to look like? Which one of this Indiana team or this Michigan State team would you want to wear your school jersey more and represent your team if their players were teleported to your university? Which one? I think it's clear that that's Indiana here. And I think you see that on the defensive side of the football, where Michigan State started out the year hot. I mean, they saved Michigan State's offense, who kept shooting itself in the foot against Florida Atlantic. And the defense stepped up. And it's clearly better than almost any defense that Scotty Hazelton, I think, ever had at Michigan State. But that is a pretty low bar. And Indiana's defense, meanwhile, they're good at forcing turnovers. They're a defense that's really well coached in terms of tackling, in terms of fundamentals. They don't over-pursue. They don't under-pursue. They're not totally conservative or totally aggressive. They're, again, well coached. The defensive coordinator they have, who came over from James Madison, worked with Curt Cignetti, who led an elite group of 5 defense last year. A lot of his players, I think, can clearly play and compete with almost anyone at the Power 4 level. And that is very impressive. Indiana is second, by the way, in opponent fourth down conversion percentage. They held Nebraska to 0 of 5 on fourth down conversions, and Washington was 1 of 3. 22.73% of opponent fourth down attempts are converted against Indiana. So being aggressive against the Hoosiers, because they're so fundamentally sound, often doesn't pay off. And that's scary when Indiana is scoring north of 40 points in almost every game, certainly every game where they're healthy. Again, they're 12th in opponent yards per play, only allowing 4.6. You look at their passing defense, again, they're only allowing 9.4 yards per completion. They have a sack percentage, an opponent average team passer rating, opponent passing first downs per game, and opponent passing yards per game that are in the top 40. And they're 25th in opponent passing yards percentage. They're 27th in sacks per game. This is all while opponents love to pass in Indiana. Indiana's secondary is targeted about as frequently as Michigan's is, where people don't run on Michigan a lot because Michigan has that defensive line, but they pass on Michigan a ton. They do, and they often have success with it. That's not necessarily the same thing with Indiana here. Again, Michigan's secondary has played tougher opponents than Indiana's has on an average basis, but still, when Indiana is facing 32.6 opponent pass attempts per game, which is 86th, Michigan State only faces an average of 27.4 per game. For context, and Indiana leads Michigan State and leads multiple teams, Power 4 and Group of 5 nationally, despite being that heavily targeted. That's impressive. They're disciplined, and they have really good players like D'Angelo Pons, who I think is the epitome of this attitude and culture on the defensive side of the football. Indiana has 24 sacks on the year, 24 passes defended, 9 interceptions, 7 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries. Michigan State, by comparison, they have 15 sacks on the season, 9 passes defended, 8 interceptions, 3 forced fumbles, and a fumble recovery. Guys, even when you factor in strength of schedule, Indiana does have the better defense here. And I would take Mikael Kamara. I would take Linnell Carr, Marcus Burris Jr., James Carpenter, Jalen Walker, Aiden Fisher, Amari Farrell, D'Angelo Pons, Josh Sanguinetti, Sean Asbury II, and Jameer Johnson over Jalen Thompson, Alex Van Sumeren, Daquan Deuce, Chris Bogle, Cal Halliday, Jordan Turner, Charles Brantley, Nakai Martinez, Malik Spencer, Ed Woods, and Angelo Gross. I would. This is a better defense than what Michigan State has. And in the trenches, I think that Indiana has the better D-line and certainly the better offensive line. So when you're better on both sides of the ball in the trenches, well, obviously 1 + 1 = 2. You're going to have the better trench play. No further conversation. I am more impressed, though, with Michigan State special teams unit. I think they have one of the better special teams units nationally. Awesome punter in Ryan Eckley, who's top 10 nationally in yards per punt. Jonathan Kim is one of the elite kickers in college football. He just did an unusual miss against Michigan from inside the 10. It was a bit poorly angled, too. And later in that game, he hits a long field goal. He is a weapon for Michigan State, and he's helped them compensate for a lot of their red zone issues and ineptitude. I love Michigan State special teams, their punter, their kicker. Indiana, they have a good kicker. They have a good punter as well, but I think Michigan State outclasses them a bit in special teams. And as for coaching, this was tough. It was tough because in the preseason, I thought that Jonathan Smith was way better than Curt Cignetti, but I don't think I did enough research on Curt Cignetti. I still think that Jonathan Smith is an elite head coach. I do. I also think, though, that what Curt Cignetti has done this year and at previous stops shows that he is an elite head coach. I am going to buy early on Curt Cignetti. I am, because this is not his final year in the Power Four. He is going to do bigger and better things than what he's doing in Indiana this year. And what he's doing in Indiana this year, the trends say is going to turn out to be historic. I think he's one of the best head coaches in the country. And Jonathan Smith, I think, has a better resume from a pure Power 5, Power 4 perspective at the moment. That could be different at the end of the year, though. But I think that both of these coaches are highly respected. They should be highly respected. I just think that really what the tiebreaker was for me is Curt Cignetti has done a better job this season as a head coach than Jonathan Smith has. I also think that Indiana has the better defensive coaching staff. It's a push for me when you look at the offense and the strength and conditioning. If you put a gun to my head, didn't pull the trigger yet though, because you don't want to kill me, I would take Michigan State's strength and conditioning program. I really like Mike McDonald and what he did at Oregon State. And I would take probably, I don't know. I think it's a true push on offense to the point where you put a gun to my head. It would take me a few minutes, or I would be begging for you to give me more time to choose. Because yes, Jonathan Smith and Brian Lindgren are some of the best in the business, seriously, at this stuff with offensive scheming. However, what Mike Shanahan and Curt Cignetti have done offensively is nothing short of impressive, a sign of elite coaching. So I actually think Indiana has the slight coaching edge here. And for any other staff in the Big Ten, compared to Michigan State staff, I would give, outside of maybe Penn State, because I think their assistant coaching staff is one of the best in college football, I'd probably give Michigan State a coaching edge, honestly. And also outside of comparing Ryan Day with Jonathan Smith right now. But that's very few coaching staffs in the Big Ten or nationally are better than Michigan State's. Indiana's is one of them, in my opinion, right now. And that leads me to believe that Indiana is going to win this game. They're going to cover. I think they're going to win big. Will it be competitive? I think so. I think that Michigan State's going to come out and they're going to be mad from last week. They're going to be angry. But their red zone deficiencies will catch up to them because Indiana's very efficient in the red zone. Indiana's receivers against Michigan State's DBs is a nightmare matchup. It's the same thing with Indiana's offensive tackles against Michigan State's pass rushers. Taven Jackson or Curtis Rourke, whoever it is, they're going to have all the time in the world to throw. Indiana will be able to, at the very worst, average 3.5, 4 yards per carry pretty consistently. That'll allow them to convert drives and keep Michigan State's defense honest. I don't think this Spartan defense is going to, honestly, to be able to do much against this Indiana offense. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on this Michigan State offense. If they want to win this game, Michigan State, they're going to have to score, I think, in the lower 30s if they want to win. And at this current moment, I don't think they can do that against this Indiana defense. So I'm picking Indiana to win 38-16. I think the majority of Michigan State's points will be scored in the first half, first three quarters, as Indiana begins to pull ahead, and them scoring touchdowns versus Michigan State kicking field goals widens Indiana's margin, widens their lead. Michigan State will do what good coaching staffs do. They'll go for it. They'll fail because Indiana's good on fourth down defense. And at that point, the game will get out of hand. Indiana will cover. They'll move on to 9-0, 6-0 in Big Ten play to face Michigan next weekend. Michigan State, well, they'll fall to 4-5. And I believe, am I correct in saying this? And then we'll get out of here. I believe that they do have, they have a bye after this game. Yes, they do. They have a bye after this matchup. So they'll go into the bye to prep for a big game for them and also for Illinois on the road in Champaign, November 16th. Thank you all so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Color OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismart, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, Will Loftus for being all-conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Please check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Go Hoosiers, and go green.